Then with that, shall we talk about Alan Wake?
I think we should, in fact, talk about Alan Wake.
I'm Adrian Sandoval,
And I'm Lamont Williams.
and we are playing Dread. This month, we are talking about Alan Wake. I am so gosh darn excited. Lamont, are you allowing me to rant about this because it's my birthday month? Is that why this is happening?
Adrian, that is absolutely why it's happening. I know that you're excited, and I'm excited for everyone to hear how stoked you are for this episode.
Yes, and it's going to be fun talking about this one in particular because I was really excited for this game. I think I was like amped about this game for at least 4 years or so before it actually came out, like history that we're going to talk about in this podcast. And then when it actually did come out, and I played it, I was like, that was pretty cool. I didn't actually become as much of a super fan as I am until the last couple of years, but we're going to dive into all of that over the course of this podcast. One of what I think is probably the most underappreciated video games, and I'm hoping that it's starting to get its due now that Alan Wake 2 is out. We're going to cover all of those things in this next hour and a half. But as I'm always kind of curious to hear from you, Lamont, about your history with this game. Because, like I said, I was really excited about this in the lead up to it for a couple of years before you and I became roommates and everything. So the game didn't actually come out until after we had kind of gone our separate ways, at least in terms of our living situation. I remember this being one of the first games actually I played in my first like solo domicile. It's so funny because I was so excited about this before I ever even went into college, and then I didn't actually play it. It didn't actually come out many years later. So I actually really don't know what your history with this game is, or the studio behind it, Remedy, prior to its actual release.
So, Adrian, here's the thing with Alan Wake. I knew about the game because of you, because I know that you showed it to me when we were living together. But thinking about I think I said it before, 2010 was the year that I was prepping for my son to get born. So there are a lot of games, a lot of things that kind of fell through the cracks for me, and this is one of them. And honestly, the full disclosure is that I did not touch this game for a long time. Like, you really pushed me to play it, and at some point I did. I was like, I need to play this, and I played like the very beginning, and I got through the intro. I got into like the oh, what was that area? The logging yard area. And then I don't remember how far I got. Those are my like big memories, is that I remember playing through the beginning, getting all the way through that like logging yard, but I don't know if I ever finished the first episode. And I know we're gonna talk about like the way that the game worked and how episodic it is, but I want to say that like for me in the first Alan Wake game, I didn't make it through that first episode. But I will say that like by the time the second game came out, boy was I hype. And I know that like we're not going to really talk about Control too much, but Control really was the game that made me realize, oh no, I need like to really embrace Alan Wake. I need this in my life.
Yeah, I mean, Remedy as a studio, which is going to be a big theme of this podcast, is really is something special, and what has made them something special has existed like since the near beginnings of the studio, which we'll dive into with Max Payne a little bit in this podcast. And a lot of that like thing that people are really attracted to now that both Control and Alan Wake 2 are out, like those elements have always been there in all of their games, even though like I think only they were a cult studio with a cult fandom up until recent history. And for myself, I didn't really play their earlier games prior to Alan Wake. So I didn't really kind of understand just like how tied thematically like all of their games are, and how like again the different things that make the studio special have just always been there from the beginning. Even I didn't really understand that playing the first Alan Wake. But as you kind of alluded to, it's not a surprise to me that, it was me who introduced you to the game, because I was very hyped about it really since that first trailer that they showed, the I Am Awake trailer, which seems so silly, but then you remember it's the Max Payne studio, Max Payne, Alan Wake, ha ha ha. Again, like that, the things that all of their games share together are like right there, I think, just in these two characters' names, the names of these two games. But it was really a mutual of both of ours, Bren, who had played the earlier Max Payne games and told me a lot about them, and they were just as hyped about Alan Wake as I was. If anything, I would say that Bren, being a fan of like horror game titles like Silent Hill and such, we were very excited, or I should say they were very excited about a horror version of Max Payne, a game that they were really, really, really into. So, we were both following the development of this game very closely, and it's so funny because again it took so long for it to actually come out. Like I remember us talking about like different interviews on the internet or in gaming magazines in their parents' attic. So this would have been like 2003, 2004, right? And the game didn't actually come out until 2010. So that just kind of gives everybody listening to this who wasn't aware just kind of an idea of like how long there was in a gap between Max Payne 2 and the first Alan Wake. Is just this giant gap, and the game changed so much from those original interviews during that time. And in fact, I've actually got the Wikipedia article open in front of me here. Wikipedia, which is a great resource of very accurate information, 100% accurate all the time. But it says this title was once suspected to be vaporware because of the length of time it took to produce and release. So, and I can't even really tell you what it was that had me so excited about this game, having not played Max Payne. I think it really was just residual excitement from Bren. But regardless, the game did come out. It eventually came out in 2010, which you alluded to. I actually want to look up, make sure I have the exact date. May 14th, 2010. Do you all know, Lamont, what also came out on May 14th, 2010?
Oh, honestly, I actually do. Uh, Correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm pretty sure that was Red Dead.
Yeah, it was the day of Red Dead Redemption's release. It could not have come out at a worse time.
Yeah, like that is such a Alan Wake having to compete with Red Dead. That is that is rough. Like to be overshadowed, and I mean, I guess best like if you're going to be overshadowed by anything, Red Dead isn't a bad one, but that is so hard really for any company when you know you have to compete with something of that caliber, something that is almost game changing. Pardon the usage of that word here, but it really was.
Yeah, no, Red Dead really is kind of a watershed title in a lot of ways that I respect and understand. That being said, I've never been a huge Red Dead fan, at least that first game. Red Dead Redemption 2 is actually a completely different story, but that's for another time. At the time playing Alan Wake, what I told people was, I had the option between Red Dead Redemption and Alan Wake, and I made the correct choice, which was getting Alan Wake. We've already alluded to that I'm a gigantic fan of this game, but I want to make sure I'm 100% clear here. I was super hyped for it when it was coming out. I played the game when it finally did, and my reaction was, that was pretty good. And then I did not touch it again until Control came out. So when I say something like, I made the correct choice for, Alan Wake versus Red Dead, I want to be clear. It's not because like of a biasness because I had hyped myself up to turn this into the best game of all time in my head. No, I had realistic expectations. good time to note some of the things that happened in between the announcement of the title and the actual final version of the game that we got. When Alan Wake was originally announced, it was actually announced as an open world title. It was going to be Remedy's first foray into a Grand Theft Auto style open world adventure game. And the thing that made that stand out at a time when there were, it wasn't like the explosion of open world games that was going to happen when Assassin's Creed 2 came out or anything, but, open world was still a pretty common game genre because of Grand Theft Auto 3. But what made Alan Wake stand out was the fact that, again, it was going to be a horror game. It was going to be a Resident Evil. So how do you do a Resident Evil or even like a Silent Hill in a true open world, right? That question had been on a lot of people's brains. And that was one of the big things that got, I think, me and Bren very excited. The funny thing is, though, is that like over time, over the next like couple of years, Alan Wake was changed to be a episodic based game. And by episodes, let's be clear, it was released all in one package. Episodes here could really just be levels in any other older video game. Lamont, were you aware? Did you see that the game had originally started as an open world title?
So, yes, and I was gonna kind of touch on that because, like, the fact that it was originally slated to be open world, and also, I mean, it was developed, they were in development for years with it being an open world, definitely helped them in the long run.
Yeah, I remember, and I don't know what magazine it was from, but it stuck in my head. And if I can find the original interview, I'll put it in the show notes. But there was an interview with the creative director Sam Lake, who I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot about in this episode. But he basically said that like one of the challenges of doing like an open world game is that it was really hard to like create like a dramatic narrative and then like have your scene cut away to your character driving up in like a giant monster truck, right? Lamont, I don't know if you've ever seen there's a ProZD or someone skit about like cutscenes in video games that have create characters or any kind of like creative customization.
I have seen so many of his videos that, like, kind of he has a couple that do that, and, yes, absolutely, I have.
Yeah, I'm gonna put that in the show notes too. But it's basically that's what Sam Lake's talking about here. Is that, like in an open world game, you can usually like dress up your character or you can have like so many different vehicles. So, you want like in a game that's like reflecting those kinds of choices, you want those choices to carry over into the narrative and things. But, especially the kind of games that Remedy had become known with something like a Max Payne, yeah, being able to do any kind of like dramatic storytelling, but also like have that kind of like open world kind of freedom. Yeah, I agree that it's going to be very hard. I do wonder if it was more practical of a decision. Like that sounds like a really good way of phrasing it in an interview. I do wonder how much more it had to do with just like being able to hit a deadline.
I agree, but I do feel as though, when they were talking a little bit about how they wanted it to work, like the day-night cycles and how, during the gameplay for day, that was when you were, like, gathering your items, like getting your ammo and getting everything ready for the night cycle, because during the day you weren't being attacked. During the night, that's when like all of the monsters and stuff would come into play. And I feel like maybe there was some game flow issues when it came to that narrative, as far as the narrative goes, because like it's very hard to like have a fear scary driven thing happen when you have like, this is your daytime, get all your resources, this is your nighttime, fight for your life. And like making that work with the narrative, I feel like that may have been a game flow issue.
Yeah, for sure. And especially when you mention like it's hard to make things scary when you know what you're preparing for. I've actually seen other games that have kind of like a creative use of a duology, like say a night day cycle, kind of run into that issue where it's like, but I know what like once you kind of get that cycle in your brain, you kind of know what's coming and you know what to prepare for. So it's kind of hard to like build that tension. Though I think that that's also going to tie into some of the other things we're going to talk about with this game, in particular the question of whether or not it's actually a horror game. But so real quick, before we talk about the actual game that came out, I kind of want to back up a little bit and talk about like Remedy prior to the release of Alan Wake, including their previous games, because they're kind of important to this discussion. We're not going to talk too much about them because obviously this is a podcast about Alan Wake, but they do tie in. So I've never actually played the first game from Remedy, a game that was called Death Rally that was released in 1995. I'm much more familiar with Max Payne, but that being said, I actually think 1995 is an interesting date for Remedy to have started as a company, considering the games that they make and things that they're going to do in their future release. So, Lamont, are
Yes.
you familiar with the phrase Sillywood? I don't know if we've actually talked about it in this podcast before. We might have.
Sillywood, I've never heard of this phrase in my life. Like, this is the first time for me.
Yeah, so Sillywood was a period in game development history that essentially was when a lot of Hollywood was starting to get interested in video games. It's also the period of time when the CD-ROM kind of first started becoming popularized. We entered that multimedia era where you started to see a lot more video in not just games, but also just on computers and such. Multimedia
Okay.
is such a dumb name, especially for video games, because aren't they all multimedia? Isn't all video multimedia? It's sound, it's visuals, right?
So you took me to a place with that just now.
Sure.
And yes, I'd never heard of that, but I remember this time. I remember this time like vividly. Like it takes me back to like gateway stores.
Oh, right, right. Yeah, the gateway stores or like it's funny whenever I talk about this in game history class, I talk about how like old computer stores like your Comp USAs and such used to be set up like car showrooms.
Yes.
But we've actually have kind of gone back to that, so that's not that foreign of an idea anymore. Like you go to a Best Buy, they're kind of set up similarly, and you still have like the salesperson who comes in to talk you through all the new features and everything.
Yeah, I didn't think about that, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, we've kind of gone back to that, but like the big showcase of the mid-ish 90s was the CD-ROM, where they would show you, oh, look, this computer comes with an encyclopedia, where the encyclopedia talks to you, and you get a video presentation of this, whatever thing that you want to look up. And that was legitimately mind-blowing back then. And, the branding phrase, as we would say now, was multimedia. And what this meant for video games was that, oh, does this mean that video games will no longer be cartoons? Could we have, like, say, live action actors in our video games, right? And usually when we talk about this, like, the first thing that, like, might come to someone who was there's mind is, like, a full motion video game, like a Sewer Shark or a Night Trap. Games that, at least Night Trap, we might cover in this podcast someday. But this also extended to games like Mortal Kombat, a game that used actors and then turned them into 2D sprites because it was a way of actually like bringing the live action to video games to actually have actors instead of cartoons. And this is why I think it's actually really interesting that Remedy comes out of this period of time because, like I said, I've never played Death Rally, but you go back to Max Payne. One of the things that stood out about the game, and this is a game that like was in development in the late 90s, but eventually comes out in the early 2000s, 2001, was that there were uh televisions that actually played TV shows with live action actors, and they shot these shorts. So yeah, like it makes complete sense that a developer from this period in time would be interested in integrating live action into their game, because that was a common trope back then. Like, I don't know that a lot of people remember this, but like, say the original Twisted Metal, a launch title, or at least near to launch title, for the original PlayStation, like that game had live action cutscenes. It was not uncommon for games to, at the very least, incorporate live action, even ones that were not all live action, like a Night Trap. You know, that wasn't uncommon back then. And this has been a trademark signature of, if not Remedy games, then Sam Lake games, right? The writer of the original Max Payne, and also the face of the original Max Payne, to try and like blend these. And I kind of feel like, you know, now with Control and Alan Wake 2, we're kind of getting a glimpse into the universe of where that never went away. Like, Remedy's like the one company that stuck with that style and asked, like, how can we keep stretching this?
Yeah, no, I see exactly what you mean. And I feel like, and we probably won't get really into the weeds with Quantum Break, but I feel like Quantum Break is a really good example of this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like Quantum Break, we'll probably talk more about Quantum Break whenever we do our Alan Wake 2 episode, but no, absolutely. I think that Quantum Break was meant to be the next step, right? Going off of Alan Wake. Because when Alan Wake does eventually switch to its episodic structure, like the influence there was prestige television of the time. Prestige television pre-Netflix era, aka Lost. It is hard to understate the impact Lost had. I mean, Lost had a huge impact on all video games. Let's be clear. One day we'll do our Half-Life podcast, and well, there's a reason why Half-Life is also featured in the television show Lost. But with this game in particular, Alan Wake, like it would not surprise me if, when they were making the decision to move away from open world, that Sam Lake was watching Lost and was like, yes, this is it. This is what we're going to do. This is the direction.
Everybody's intrigued by what was it called? The mystery box?
Yeah, the mystery box. I mean, I don't want to go into a huge tangent with the mystery box, but I would say that I feel like Sam Lake is a much better writer to not have to rely on something like the mystery box. But that's my spicy take. That's not my spicy take of the day. I got a much spicier take coming down the road when we get to the game itself. But
Well, see, but the thing is that I agree with you. And I feel like, and I don't know how deep into Sam's history we're going to get. You know, we do know that in the making of Max Payne 2, like he went into an actual like writing class. And I feel like, you know, what he gained from that only helped him like figure out how to do like the Lost thing but better.
no, I absolutely agree. It's clear that that writing class had a big effect on Sam Lake and their writing. I mean, you literally see it, like, going from Max Payne 1, which is absolutely, I mean, considering that Sam Lake is Finnish and is writing material based on movies from another culture and trying to mimic that culture. Like, I think that, like, there is a lot of accomplishment in that first Max Payne, but Max Payne 2, which is the one that I've probably spent more time with versus the first game, you absolutely see that refinement in style come through. Absolutely. And we're going to talk more about that when we get into the story stuff regarding Alan Wake. Real quick list of TV shows that are featured in Max Payne are Address Unknown, which is the most important one. We're going to be talking about Address Unknown a little bit later on in the podcast. The aforementioned Lords and Ladies, Dick Justice, and The Adventures of Captain Baseball Bat Boy.
I need to make it known, by the way, that like Dick Justice I think is very funny, because there was a point where I believe I'm trying to think if it was. Yeah, I think Max Payne. I think at one point was almost Dick Justice.
Right. I mean, that's the other thing about Max Payne in particular is that it's called that because you're not supposed to take it seriously. And Dick Justice, I think, absolutely kind of speaks to that a bit. I am glad that they went with the name Max Payne, and that's something that I think also shines through in both Alan Wake games. Really, is that these are games that have serious themes and have really well written characters that feel real, but at no point are you like, does it take itself so seriously that it just takes you out of it, right? It's like Max Payne is super hyper melodramatic, but it's also winking at you in very clever ways that you never are like just completely dragged down. Because I mean, like think about this like that plot, right? The original game's plot is that this detective's wife and child are both murdered, like their baby child. Like there is an actual dead baby shown in the game, that just not something that would happen in a video game now in 2024. And yet, despite like the very purposely overwrought dramatic dialogue, it's never too heavy, which I think is just kind of a testament again to Sam Lake, even prior to, actually going into writing classes and really like honing that craft in the future games.
So full disclosure, Adrian, I have not played a Max Payne game.
Mm-hmm.
I know of them. One of my friends, Jake, is a huge fan, and he has been trying to push me to play these games for years. And kind of going into like the humor of it, he and I were having a conversation about the game and how, sometimes they'll let you do, games will let you do unexpected things. And I'm pretty sure it's the second game, you're in an elevator, there's elevator music, and he got annoyed by it and he shot the speaker. And like the character acknowledged that he was happy that the speaker was done because he was getting tired of the music.
That's such a Hideo Kojima thing to do in a video game. And also, I think it's worth noting that Hideo Kojima has a side quest with the actual, like him doing a voice of a character in Control. Very clear that Kojima and Sam Lake like to share notes with each other.
Okay, I didn't realize that. And as I said, I've played Control. I knew that Kojima was in Cyberpunk, but I didn't know
Yeah,
about Control.
there's that side quest that doesn't seem to tie to the plot at all with the Japanese hypnotherapist.
No, I don't remember this. You're
Oh,
gonna
okay.
have me going back to playing Control.
I mean, well, play Alan Wake and also play at least play Max Payne 2. But yeah, play Max Payne 2. I wouldn't suggest playing the first game, honestly. It's fine. Play the Game Boy Advance version, oddly enough. I actually like the Game Boy Advance version of Max Payne 1 better than the main game.
And I will. I will take your advice.
Yeah, I only discovered this just randomly trying games on my various devices. And then I was like, what did people say about this game back then? And then like I found this IGN review and it was like, oh, it got a 9. Like people liked the Game Boy Advance Max Payne even back then.
I mean, that's a high score.
No, that's a great, yeah, no, it's great. I was legitimately surprised. I was like, oh, I like this better than the PC version. What the heck? All right. So here is my absolute hottest take. I am, Lamont, I'm a huge fan of Control. I love that game a lot. And honestly, that was the game that got me to revisit the original Alan Wake. And then I replayed all of Alan Wake 1, and then I was like, oh, this game is really good. And then suddenly they announced the remaster. So I bought and went through all of Alan Wake again on the remaster. And then Alan Wake 2 was coming out, and I went through all of Alan Wake again. Like, I played through the original Alan Wake so many more times in the past, like, 2 years than I did like in the 14 years since it was originally released. So my hot take, probably the hottest take of this entire podcast, is that I still think, in terms of gameplay, not necessarily in terms of story or anything, but in terms of gameplay, I feel that Alan Wake 1 is still Remedy's best game. Like, in terms of, like, wanting to play the game and actually enjoying the play of the game, ignoring story, characters, voice acting, all of that other stuff around it, I enjoy the first Alan Wake more than Control, more than Alan Wake 2, and either Max Payne.
I mean, that is a pretty hot take, and it definitely it tells me that I need to really buckle down and like make my way through this game.
Well, and let's be clear that, like, this is not a take that I think anyone shares, and I'm probably gonna have to spend a little bit of time defending that take a bit. So, like, when you go to play the game and be like, this is it, this is the one Adrian is talking about, right? Says that for, please don't be surprised. One of the things I think is really interesting about Remedy as a studio, and I actually do talk about this with my game students and such, is that I think that they do a really good job of, like, making the kind of, like, one kind of game. Like, their studio has a brand. We talked about Until Dawn last time and how supermassive games have one genre, right? They have that one genre they keep coming back to. Remedy does the same thing. They're just better at hiding it. Like, if you go through Max Payne and Control and Alan Wake, they are all arena shooters. Each one, like, they're all arena shooters. They just have and Quantum Break. They're all arena shooters. They just have a different approach to an arena shooter. Max Payne is probably the purest arena shooter, right? Alan Wake is an arena shooter, but it's horror themed. Control is an arena shooter, but you have supernatural powers and it's sci-fi. Similarly with Quantum Break, but there's a time travel theme. The core of their game is big warehouse design and a lot of enemies. Like, I mean, that's also true of Alan Wake 2, and honestly, that's one of the biggest, like, critiques I have of Alan Wake 2, is that, like, I think that Alan Wake 2 works very well when there's only one or two enemies you have to deal with. But because, like, Remedy is Remedy and they treat the game like an arena shooter, you will often have, like, three or more enemies you have to deal with. And with the camera, like, so hugged on Alan's shoulders and just, like, that really tight, kind of claustrophobic, like, perspective, to me, the game kind of falls apart when you have to deal with three or more enemies, and it's unfortunate how many times it happens.
Yeah, I see it honestly exactly what you mean. And you know, I don't know how much we want to talk about too, but during the musical portion, I noticed that the most.
I think for me, it was the final fight of the game. But again, I don't want to go too deep into that until we do the Alan Wake 2 podcast. And but like, this kind of speaks to the big thing that, for me, as someone who's a huge fan of this studio and is going to play all of their games forever from now on, as long as they're around, like, which, God willing, will hopefully be a lot longer. When it comes to, like, the actual, like, gameplay of their games, I honestly think they're not that great. Like, even Control, which I think is their second strongest game, there's just too many examples of enemies that will kill you in two hits, will attack you from off screen without any warning, like, or at least do huge chunks of damage really quickly before you have a time to react. Have, like, shield gimmicks that, like the enemies that, like, put up those, like, big debris shields that you have to try and deal with, while there's a whole bunch of other enemies, like, you also have to deal with. Like, there's such a focus on crowd control, but they never really give you the time or the tools to really effectively deal with it very quickly. It's just so easy to get overwhelmed in Control without a lot of really great ways to deal with it, even when you start to get the bigger superpowers in that game. You know, and that's just a general problem with Max Payne, where you don't get to fly and throw things telekinetically at people.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I will say that talking about Control really quick, Control's gameplay is dated. It was like I remember that was the thing that I noticed is that Playing that, it was a really good 360 game post Xbox 360.
Yeah, it's Max Payne. It's Max Payne, except you can fly and throw things. And it's funny you call it a 360 game because the game that I always compare Control to is the Force Unleashed.
Oh, that's a perfect example of
Yeah,
that.
but it's Force Unleashed if Force Unleashed were better.
Also true.
Another game that I actually like, but again, I don't enjoy playing it that much, right? I enjoy playing Control a lot more than Force Unleashed, and I do like that game also quite a bit. But you're right. Like Control absolutely feels like an Xbox 360 game because like these are the games that Remedy makes. And the only reason Alan Wake 2 doesn't feel like that is because they finally upgraded to the Resident Evil 4 camera. But I think this is actually a good time to kind of talk about like why I like the gameplay of the original Alan Wake and why I think it works. So for those who are not aware of the basic like gameplay loop of an Alan Wake game, the monsters in the game are people who have been taken by a dark force that has different names depending on where in the story you are, if you're playing Control versus Alan Wake, etc., etc. But generally, they're just people who have been taken by a dark force. Not quite zombies, but effectively Resident Evil 4 style zombies. And they are completely invulnerable to attacks. But Alan has, apart from a gun to shoot enemies with, has a flashlight. That flashlight can be boosted. When you boost the flashlight, you are able to effectively burn the shielding away from the enemies and be able to get you to attack. Now, because Alan Wake is a post Silent Hill 2 horror game, your character is an everyman who doesn't really have combat experience. So they're not as effective in a fight. They all can't take as much damage as, say, a Max Payne can. So you are kind of given the choice to whether to run away or to fight. What actually makes this game work is number one, the enemies are not constantly attacking you at all times. This is something that it shares with Alan Wake 2. Like a lot of the monster design is from Alan Wake 2 is pulled directly from the first game. However, this time you have a much better view of everything that's around you. So if you do have like 3 or 4 enemies, you generally can see them. If enemies are attacking you from behind, there's really, really good sound design. It's usually like a axe or something, and you can hear it to give yourself time to either hit the dodge button or to be able to move out of the way. But number one, the fact that the enemies like give you time and like take a while before they decide whether or not they're going to attack is really nice and gives you time to make that decision whether or not you're going to run away or go. But crucially, because there are times where the game does force you to fight, and you will usually have to do this in terms of crowds or not, because again, it is an arena shooter. It is still a Max Payne. When you go to boost the flashlight, you actually have to hold the button. And you can hold it down as long as that flashlight's battery lasts. And over time, you get better flashlights that have longer times that you can hold before you have to change batteries. But once you burn that shield away, or even like before you burn the shield away, as soon as you hit an enemy with a flashlight, they will stop trying to attack you and they will instantly get stunned. So you actually have the ability to strategize in this game. So say I want to attack an enemy, I could either just continue to just boost the flashlight and burn that shield away and then start shooting at them, or I can boost one enemy, stun them, boost another enemy, stun them, boost another enemy, stun them, and then finally choose the one that I want to shoot, or I could just stun all of them and keep running. They start to attack again, turn around, boost all of them, keep running. So you effectively get a way to actually control the crowd for what I think is the only time in a Remedy game where they're all crowd shooters. That's probably the number one thing that I think makes Alan Wake work better than the rest of the games. And it was something that I had to learn, and it was only through playing the game multiple times. There's nothing in the game that trains you to play it this way. And I think that's one of the things that kind of works against it, is that again, like this is something that you kind of have to like learn and figure out for yourself, that you can like give yourself room to be able to either find an enemy to focus on or run away. But the other thing that I really like about this game is that there is nothing more satisfying than burning the shield away. The game has amazing sound design, so you get this really great, like, popping sound effect when you burn the shield away, and then that's your cue to start shooting. And all of the guns in this game feel really, really good. I mean, that's something I will say about all the Remedy shooters, is that, like, the actual, like, act of shooting has weight to it. That's something that I feel like a lot of shooters, as someone who's not a shooter fan, I didn't actually say that either, is that I actually don't really like a lot of shooters. I'm not the biggest fan of Resident Evil 4. I'm not the biggest fan of Gears of War. And a lot of that comes down to is I feel like shooting in action games feels very weightless, right? You just like hold a button and you start firing, but you don't really get the kickback. You don't really feel the weight of the gun. All of the guns feel really, really good in Alan Wake. Shooting feels good. And like the combination of popping those shields off, then firing at the enemies, and then they also make another really great, like, almost explosion-like sound when you actually do kill them, and they fade away in this, like, great light, and, like, sometimes it goes into that, like, bullet time slow motion of Max Payne. Like, it's some of the best, most rewarding feel of any game, that, like, visceral feeling of actually, like, triumph that just isn't in any of their games.
Yeah, I don't really, having not played much more than Control and 2, um, I don't really have anything on that. But I do understand what you're talking about when it comes to like that floaty, weightless kind of feeling in games. And I feel like, anybody who gets to know me through the podcast will learn like I am a huge Kingdom Hearts fan. And like that's something that I noticed in like the later games is that like fighting like with a keyblade, it feels floaty. Like that you lose that like in the first game, it was very grounded and like your blocks and everything felt like it had weight to it. And like the further in the series you go, the more it feels like you're just on air.
Yeah, also a hot take of mine is that, like, I still feel that that first Kingdom Hearts is the game that feels the best, but again, you and me have talked about that before.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yes. But, like, to be fair, I think that, like, Control and even Max Payne, but also Alan Wake 2 also have very good, like, good feeling, like, just shooting, because I think that's something that Remedy is actually very, very good at. But it does speak to, like, something I've talked to you about before. Again, this is an Alan Wake 2 podcast, but one of the changes that was made to Alan Wake 2 that I'm not a fan of is that you don't hold down the flashlight button anymore. You just press it, and you press it once and you use a charge. You press it again, you use a charge, and it just does not feel nearly as good as just holding that light on them until you get that pop of the shield going off.
Adrian, I'm going to be honest with you. I've been holding the button the whole time. I didn't realize I could just press it.
No, you just press it once and it goes. Like when you go to play Alan Wake 1, and you will feel the difference. But yeah, no, as someone who's just not a fan of shooters, I feel like it's some of the best shooting in games. And the funny thing is that Alan Wake has a standalone DLC that's half canon, half not canon. We'll talk about that a little bit later. American Nightmare, which is all focused on the shooting. They basically turned the original Alan Wake into an arcade shooter, and it actually doesn't feel as good. It's the same gameplay, but because it's a little bit more fast paced, the guns don't have quite the same weight to them. It doesn't the timing on the pop of the shield versus when you get to start firing at them again versus when they die is a lot faster, to try and like make the pace a lot faster for the game. And I don't think it actually feels as good in American Nightmare.
Which is funny because like I check out reviews and like a lot of the reviews for American Nightmare really liked the gunplay, like how that felt.
I think reviewers at the time were coming to Alan Wake and expecting a more traditional horror game. They were expecting a Resident Evil. They were expecting the game that Alan Wake 2 eventually was. But that's not what Alan Wake was. Alan Wake was a horror-themed shooter. It was not a survival horror. And I really do think that that played into some of the expectation at the time. Oh, this is a shooter. This is an action game. There's no real survival elements. while I do think that the action and the gunplay is very good, I think that it's also worth noting that, the non-story sequences, all of the levels are very samey. There's only so many ways you can make the woods of the Pacific Northwest look different.
Yeah, that is a very good point.
And it's also very easy to get lost running around those forests, and they try their best to dot the landscape with the lampposts, which are the next safety areas, because a lot of the game, like, if you choose to run, if you don't choose to fight, a lot of the game is about like running from one lamppost to the next lamppost. But there are a lot of times where you don't see the last lamppost necessarily, and again, if you don't know how to properly like kind of crowd control the monsters and you're just trying to run away, it is very, very easy to get turned around, go backwards the way that you came, because the game does not really do a really good job of creating those landmarks and creating a memorable sense of space. So it's not. I don't want to come across and say that this game doesn't have its problems. It absolutely does. I think they're mostly in navigation, but if you kind of learn how the game wants you to play it, it honestly is a blast. I still say it's one of the best feeling shooters, not just of the era, but still to this day. I have a blast playing it. Lamont, I think it's interesting you mentioned the original plan for there to be kind of this like this day-night cycle, because that still exists in the final game to a certain extent. It's just now it's controlled. It's not like after 5 minutes night falls kind of game.
Okay, yeah.
As we mentioned before, every level of the game is an episode, and very clearly meant to be modeled after an episode of prestige TV from the mid 2000s period. Again, your Losts or your 24s, where you get a narration by our main character, Alan Wake. Then you do a story sequence where is mostly just Alan walking around while people talk at him, kind of in a Half-Life style, where people are talking and you are getting story, but it's not in a bespoke cutscene. It's not something that you're just watching. Like, you are Alan, you are walking around, you are moving, you do get a decision of who to talk to and who not to talk to. Sometimes there are actions you have to take. This is especially true in the very first episode when you first arrive at the town of Bright Falls and you go into the diner. You meet Rose for the first time. Rose, who's like a huge super fan to Alan. And then once that conversation happens, depending on like which direction you go, you're supposed to go towards the bathroom. But if you go towards the right-hand side, you might run into these two old guys who ask you to play a song on the jukebox. And so, the narrative isn't just strictly just watching cutscenes. I think that with a game that is so clearly inspired by other narrative action games of the time, quote unquote Metal Gear Solid, it's really easy to like think of Alan Wake as a game of just watch stuff and not getting to play a lot of the game, but that's not really a fair characterization. There's not really much in the way of choices that you get to make. You're pretty much just kind of following, the path until you get from one story beat to the other. But there are these sequences that you have to do prior to going to the night sequences, which is where you are facing against the Taken monsters that we talked about earlier. It's not an uncommon structure, but I don't know of any other game that leaned so heavily into the television aesthetic or the prestige TV aesthetic prior to Alan Wake. I'm sure that others existed, and there's also there's an Xbox 360 Lost game, for example, that might have just tried to mimic the TV show. I haven't actually played that game, so I don't know too much about it, but
Yeah, same, same. So I don't know on that one. And I'm sure you're right. And I'm really trying to think of other games that may have done that, but nothing is coming to mind.
yeah. So at this stage, I think it's also just kind of worth noting that, like, in the tradition of Max Payne, again, a lot of this characterization and dialogue in this game are they're good for the time. I wouldn't say that this game is particularly like a watershed moment in video game voice acting or anything, but for a game that is so interested in playing with its meta aspects between having certain sequences of the characters being portrayed by live action actors, by kind of winkingly knowing it's a video game and an artistic creation, but also kind of pretending to be a television show. I think that that helps elevate the material at least a little bit. Nothing about the dialogue is particularly spectacular. Nothing about the acting is particularly spectacular, but it all comes together very, very well. Mostly because, again, I think that they just had a really good sense of the kind of game, the kind of story, and the kind of tone they were trying to do, and really did end up making something that really felt like a good prestige television show at the time. It just happens to be one that you can play.
I do also feel like, some of the stuff that they achieved comes down to like, I want to say technical limitations. Thinking about like how they had to work around things like faces and textures and stuff like that. Like there are things that they had to do to make do that really allowed them to excel in other places.
Yeah, for sure. And like we're still not really in the era of like really great facial capture or anything. And so it's even more daring really to like kind of blend live action and 3D in a way. Because like this game, Max Payne had still screenshot book panels, but like they were still, like very famously Sam Lake is Max Payne, so it's his face on that like 3D model texture, but also his face in those comic book sequences. This game actually has like the body actors for most of its characters that you actually get to see in live action, particularly Alan. There's a whole like television talk show sequence in this game. If you've played Alan Wake 2, there's a lot of that in that game, but like there's one in particular standout sequence where you're like playing Alan Wake in the video game, watching his live action self do a talk show sequence, right? And like, yeah, those technical limitations that you're mentioning, like actually being able to like pull something like that off and doing it convincingly at the time, just really just stands out to like the kind of things that I think make this game so special. Going back to the writing too a little bit, I think that another thing that like stands out to me, like, and we're not going to do like a fool's like story breakdown of this game, like just go play it. I think that especially if you've played Alan Wake 2, I think that there are some interesting things to note from this game, which is absolutely not being made with Alan Wake 2 in mind. One of the things that stands out to about Alan Wake, and what to me is like the biggest testament on how it is, despite the hokey dialogue, and maybe partially intentionally hokey dialogue, is that its main character and the other character that you spend a lot of time with, we'll talk about in a second, they're not good characters. And I don't mean, when I say not good characters, I don't mean like poorly written characters. I just mean that they're not good people. Like Alan is not a good person. And it is such a hard thing to do in writing to get you to care about a character who is naturally a jerk.
Yeah. Yeah, honestly that is very hard.
Celebrity culture, and particularly how celebrities are presented on television versus like their actual personas and how people perceive them. These aren't necessarily major themes of the game, but I absolutely think that was something Sam Lake was thinking a lot about when creating Alan. I think that Alan is presented right from the beginning of the game to not be this like amazing character. Like he is a well-known writer, but there's nothing that really suggests that he's a good writer. And in fact, he sounds like someone he sounds like any agent's worst nightmare, honestly, from the beginning. And we'll talk about his agent in a little bit. But, he got popular from a popular series of books, which the Alex Casey books, which are a thinly veiled camouflage for Max Payne, which Remedy does not have the rights to. Apogee and then had the rights, and then those were sold to Electronic Arts, so they couldn't use Max Payne in the game. But the idea is that the Alex Casey books that he's known for are meant to be the Max Payne stories, and we just got done talking about how the Max Payne games are kind of written very tongue-in-cheek. So these Alex Casey books are, they're popular with a certain segment of the United States. People like, say, for example, Rose, the waitress. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're very good. And Alan sort of recognizes they're not very good. So, like, the whole premise of the game is that he's coming to Bright Falls to try and, like, get over his writer's block because he's trying to write, like, a new novel that'll really mean something, man. But, that also is very challenging for him because he's just not a very good writer. These are all things that are just, like, very well implied in the game. And then, like, the actual inciting incident that starts the story with him having to save his wife from this, like, presence inside of a lake starts because, because of an argument that he does not handle very well. Lamont, I know you said that, like, it's been a while since you played the game, but do you remember, like, the opening moments with him and his wife and the argument that starts the whole thing?
Yes, absolutely, I do.
I think that it is fair to say that Alan's anger is not unwarranted. Number one, his wife bringing him to Bright Falls. Wife, by the way, name is Alice Wake. Bringing him to Bright Falls under false pretenses, wanting him to talk to a therapist who turns out to be one of the villains in the game without discussing any of that with Alan. Yes, not a great look, but as we learn throughout the game, part of and mostly honestly in the paid DLC, a lot of that decision was spurred on because Alan is not the easiest to live with. He has streaks of anger. He does not deal with being seen very well. And then we basically get to see the worst of Alan when he blows up at his wife. Like, it's not that, like I said, when I say that his anger isn't misplaced, I think there are reasons to be upset, but he does not handle it very well, and those directly lead to his wife in peril.
Yep, absolutely.
And, when you do complete that first level, that's when his agent Barry enters the scene, and we don't get the best picture of Barry either. Barry is very belligerent and very disrespectful to anyone living in, like, places that are not New York, essentially, like, the considering everybody a yokel or a hick. This also leads with Alan punching the aforementioned therapist and Barry just enabling this behavior. Like, these two are not great people. And yet, one of the things that I love about this game is that it is essentially about a bromance. This is a bromance game.
Oh, yes, that is true.
100%. Like, I'm gonna again, I recommend everyone play the game, but in the show notes I'm gonna include one of my favorite scenes, which involves Barry and Alan having a heart to heart, or at least Barry getting some of his frustration out on Alan using one of his cardboard standees. It is an amazing relationship, and what feels to me like a very real friendship by two very real, very vulnerable people who've really only gotten the chance to have a heart to heart because suddenly they find themselves in extraordinary circumstances. Like, all of this is contained in what is ultimately a very silly Lost meets Twin Peaks pastiche, but I think all of it just kind of really speaks to the fact that that Alan Wake really does kind of have its own voice in a way that a lot of video games, even to this day, really have a hard time finding, let alone the 2010s, which honestly was not one of my favorite periods in video games.
There's something I would like to mention about like development wise. I think I do still love that because it was an open world game at first, there is so much map in the game that was already built. It really made development interesting, and that like they could really work on like the fact that it became a linear game, but they had so much space so they could really make things cinematic and like how the camera works, how it follows, how like it will show you that there's an area that you're going to be going to later and you can see it in the background because it's already rendered, it already exists on this full huge map that even though you don't have access to it all, it's still there and it's still relevant.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually really interesting. I would have loved to have known what Bright Falls looked like as an open world game, because it does really feel like that it has a sense of place, which is something that I feel like they play on a lot more in Alan Wake 2, which is also not an open world game, but you actually do get to see some of the surrounding areas like Watery, for example. And yeah, I can imagine that like probably really did help a lot. Is that they at one point there probably was like all of these like kind of that you only get to see in like these little bespoke like little sections. At one point was just a bespoke like stitched together world.
But I do like that because they had all of that space. I mean, they really found a way to make use of it in like the I think it was like the thermoses that you have to find and like just where they hid little things. Really they're able to do it because they had an open world that they created and then they could really just, you know, confine you in that and really like, I don't want to say put you in the hallway, but they could really like um they could create the scene and they had the space to do it.
Well, also too, part of that contributes to the problem I was talking about earlier about like it's easy to get lost in the game because they have these like open wide spaces that
Hmm.
are mostly samey looking, the woods, right? Um, and that contributes to it. But I think one of the more interesting things too is vehicles. Like there are still vehicles you can drive in this not open world game. And there are multiple segments that kind of feel like monster truck rallies, which is funny because that's not a thing anymore. Like, if there are any younger listeners, they're gonna be like, "What the heck's a monster truck rally?" Um, but yeah, like all of these like little elements ended up becoming these just kind of like, oh, like almost kind of just weird. Well, they're here, like open world design, like open map design for each level, and vehicles that you can drive around. Like all of these here as just kind of like a shadow of the game that almost was.
And like I do find all of that to be interesting. And as you said, the vehicle thing I think really ties into like the former open world that like the game was supposed to be.
So, okay, so you haven't beaten the game, but you are at least aware of what the final results of it are with Alan switching places with his wife in the dark place, stuck there, but also as part of the consequence of that, it creates the evil doppelganger, which is Mr. Scratch, or at least so he's told. So, and it's important context here. Again, we're not going to spoil anything about Alan Wake 2, but if you have played Alan Wake 2, you should know. I mean, there was an Alan Wake 2 that they were working on that is completely different from the game that we actually got. There are prototype videos out there. I'll put them in the show notes, but I think it's important to keep in mind that like the direction that Alan Wake 2 eventually ends up going is completely different from what the original plan was. And really with developing the first Alan Wake, I think it's safe to say there was no plan. There wasn't really a big plan in place, at least like prior to the game's like actual release. Like obviously by the time the game gets released, they're prepping a sequel, they have some ideas, but the development of the evil doppelganger, I don't think they had completely in mind beyond just yeah, Twin Peaks was cool. We liked how Twin Peaks ended.
Ah, yes, good old Bob.
Well, okay, so I say that. I say that. But, Lamont, let's go back to what we were talking about earlier. The television show Address Unknown. which is one of the big shows that you see throughout Max Payne 2. Do you know what Address Unknown's premise is?
I do not.
So Address Unknown, as it is shown in Max Payne 2, a game that came out in like 2003, is a show that, as I'm reading from the fandom wiki right now, originally aired in the early 1990s. So it's supposed to be a pastiche of early 1990s neo-noir thrillers,
All right.
where in noir York City, where a character named John is paranoid that he is being watched by a man in the mirror named John Mira. And it is an evil doppelganger version of himself that is also stalking his girlfriend,
Oh,
who may or may not exist or also just be him.
that is oddly complicated.
But also, boy, sure sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think this is also worth noting that the original Mr. Scratch, who I should mention in the ending to the original Alan Wake, is just called like Mr. just like a weird noise plays.
That
They don't actually start calling him Mr. Scratch until the DLC. It's supposed to be like Mr. Record Scratch, right? Like his name is like scratched out. Is a big part of American Nightmare, where American Nightmare kind of gets us a better idea of what like Alan Wake 2 probably originally was going to be. This is kind of why I say it's like half canon, half not.
yes.
I think its current canon status is that, it's something that Alan experienced in the dark place, but not necessarily something that actually happened.
Okay, that's fair.
What I think is really funny, if you go back to how Mr. Scratch is portrayed in there, it is so different from the Mr. Scratch that we eventually see in Alan Wake 2. Specifically, it's American Psycho.
Oh, I see.
I posted the videos in the Discord. They'll be in the show notes. But Lamont, if you check this out, you will see a Mr. Scratch that is absolutely Christian Bale's character from American Psycho.
I'm actually putting that on right now.
Yeah, I just had another thought. It's not just American Psycho Christian Bale, it's also the dude from Reservoir Dogs.
Oh my god, yes.
Like the inspiration's pretty clear.
Yeah, absolutely it is.
Yeah, Mr. Scratch, originally a little bit Christian Bale, American Psycho, a little bit Harvey Keitel, Reservoir Dogs. But here's the other thing I find really, really fascinating about all this, right? So clearly this ending is a pastiche of the ending of Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks The Return. Twin Peaks The Return, 2017. It is fascinating to me that Mr. Scratch. Well, actually, it's fun. I didn't even think about this when Alan Wake 2 came out. I thought about this playing American Nightmare. I'm playing American Nightmare and how they depict Mr. Scratch, and I'm like, oh my god, they predicted Twin Peaks The Return like 7 years before it actually happened.
That is kind of crazy. And I remember watching Twin Peaks The Return, like I was on top of that one.
Obviously, again, they're kind of doing a more like outlandish, cartoonish version with Mr. Scratch, but the idea of like the evil doppelganger out in the real world while the other person is stuck in a alternate universe idea is like right there, and they like almost like one for one kind of a lot of the same ideas happening here, with them terrorizing people. Well, terrorizing people in the other's life and such is just crazy to me that like Remedy went that direction so long before Twin Peaks does.
I mean, it tells you that they really, really got a grasp on like that kind of story.
All right, before we like talk about kind of the post Alan Wake era, like what happens like directly following the game's release, I think there's one thing we haven't mentioned yet that I feel you absolutely need to talk about, which is the music. Music is very standout in Alan Wake because it's very clear that like because the game has cinematic aspirations and particularly television aspirations, they wanted to make sure that it had an appropriate soundtrack too. A lot of television uses a lot of appropriate licensed music, and Alan Wake is no different. There are so many classic bands and some like music that was maybe not like the most popular music at the time, although it did end up creating some notoriety around some. I know, for example, one of the episodes, episode 4, ends with the song Haunted by Poe. Poe ended up getting something of a small cult following, following Alan Wake, which is so funny because the band, I think, actually ended up uh, disbanding shortly after the release of the game.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
They came back for Alan Wake 2, kinda, sorta. Um, but regardless, there is, outside of the original band that we'll talk about, Children of the Elder Gods, there's so much licensed music in this game that almost kind of worked to the game's detriment. A lot of the reason why this game did not get its remaster until so late, and the reason why it's kind of it would be on Steam and then it would get taken off of Steam, then it would come back, is because, they had to keep updating these licenses, which gets really expensive after a time. I think it's really a testament to how much everyone involved with this game, both its original publisher, Microsoft, as well as just Remedy Studios, to like try and keep it alive despite the complications of licenses. You don't see that with other games, especially games that were at the time considered like, I don't really want to call Alan Wake a failure, but I mean it, like, there's a reason why it took so long for the sequel to come out, is because, Microsoft decided not to go ahead with the original Alan Wake 2 plan.
And I mean, that was, Microsoft put a lot into it. When you think about like all of the ad deals and everything else that was surrounding it.
Yeah, that the famous Verizon deal, which there's an Easter egg in the game. Like, you get an achievement for watching a Verizon commercial in the original version that is no longer in current releases of the game. They did a whole television prequel that well, not, it never aired on television, but it was like a web series that you could watch on YouTube prior to the release of the game. It came with a big special edition that included a full book that you could read. Yeah, no, absolutely. Microsoft put a lot into the game, and you know, far be it for me to like credit like giant corporations, but the fact that like I feel like Microsoft has played ball so much with Remedy with this game, all the way, like not just like helping to renew all those music licenses, but also essentially giving them the IP back so that they could do a sequel with a different partner. I think all of that stuff is absolutely to their credit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, for all of my boasting, for all of my praise that I have for this game, the unfortunate truth of the matter is that there was never an Alan Wake 2. Absolutely never. Just never happened.
Or at least not in the way that like I think was originally planned.
Obviously, yeah, no, obviously that's not true. Although I do have something I'm going to post in the show notes, which is a Sam Lake talking about how Alan Wake 2 was not going to happen and that they were moving on to a new project, as an absolute video that was made at one point in time prior to the release of the other to Alan Wake, was him just having to tell everybody that they were unfortunately not making the Alan Wake 2. Now, I will say that also will be in the show notes is the prototype footage of what was originally going to be Alan Wake 2. And I gotta say, I think we're actually kind of lucky that we got the Alan Wake 2 that we did. There are some really neat things in the Alan Wake 2 prototype, mostly in terms of how they were kind of advancing the enemy AI, how they were going to integrate Alan as a writer more into the mechanics of the original Alan Wake 2. But that being said, it kind of looks like more of the same. Their concept for the story just didn't work for me with I guess the idea is that Alan is now kind of has mastered control of the dark place. Almost makes me wonder if some of the ideas that would eventually go into Quantum Break and then later Control were going to get worked into Alan Wake 2. And it all kind of felt a little too Matrixy to me, I think.
Yeah, I can see that.
Like when I beat the original Alan Wake, my thought for what might make a cool sequel was what if the next game was Alice Wake? Like Alice, there's already something inherently interesting there. Number one, Alice's big thing is that she has a fear of the dark, right? That's like an actual phobia that she has. And the idea of a character having to work through that to be able to go on a similar journey to save her husband, I think that would have been an absolutely fascinating thing to explore. I think that the concept of Alan Wake kind of becoming a demigod because of the dark place has some interesting things to explore, which they kind of do in Alan Wake 2. Again, no spoilers for now. But yeah, the original like plot for the first game, as well as like kind of what a lot of the gameplay looked like, doesn't work for me as well as like that game, the game that we eventually will get years down the road.
I mean, those are very interesting concepts, though. I would like to see more of Alice's story. You know, they keep telling us that there's something there. I would love to know more about it.
Yeah, no, I like there was stuff about like Alice that always struck me as very interesting. And again, I think it is to the credit of the writing of Alan Wake 1 that she was not just the damsel in distress. I mean, she was. Let's be 100% clear about this. This is still a game about a guy having to rescue his girlfriend and that being the main motivation. But Alice does not stop being a character. It's not quite as well done as I would say, like say Laura Palmer from Twin Peaks never stops being a character. Like it's never to that degree. But Alice's motivations are continually explored. The relationship between Alan and his wife are explored very well. She is not just someone to be rescued, and I think that one thing I was very happy about with Alan Wake 2 is that that was also something that was recognized and continued in that plot. And even like American Nightmare, which is a very strange game. Alice plays a big role in American Nightmare in a lot of the themes that are carried forward into the Alan Wake 2 that we did eventually get are in American Nightmare. And like even Quantum Break, which has a little Alan Wake 2 teaser video where we get to see the original Saga Anderson and Alex Casey being played by Sam Lake as he is in the real Alan Wake 2. I feel like that this original Alan Wake 2 probably was going to play into some of these ideas, that some of the things that carried over into the Alan Wake 2 that we get probably were there. It probably wasn't just going to be now Alan Wake is Neo, which is kind of what the description of the gameplay to me sounded like they were thinking. There probably was something smarter going on there we would have gotten, but we'll never know now. All we have is this 13 minutes of gameplay footage for what might have been, but we did eventually get a real Alan Wake 2, and it's very good. You all should go play it. Someday we'll do a whole podcast about it.
And I am really looking forward to that one because where I dropped the ball on Alan Wake 1, I have not on 2. And I am really enjoying everything about that.
But to wrap this up, I just want to say again that if you've never experienced the original Alan Wake, give it a try. And I think it's time to be fair to it. I'm glad that Alan Wake 2 exists. I'm glad that Alan Wake 2 Although it seems like early word is that it wasn't like a super huge success. It obviously got a lot more attention and was a lot more successful critically than the original Alan Wake. And I think it's time for the original Alan Wake to get its due. It did so many things so different and so special compared to a lot of games of the 2010 era. Some things that I think still hold up really, really well. I do know that saying something like that you kind of have to learn how the game wants you to play it can be really annoying. Like a good game should tell you how it wants you to play it. But I think that, like, given its due, there's something really, really special there, and the remaster is really, really good, and it plays super well on most modern machines. So, yeah, give that a look. I think that's all I got. Lamont, you have any other final thoughts to wrap this up?
Honestly, I don't. I plan on really taking on the first Alan Wake because, as I said, I am really enjoying the second one. I beat the first playthrough. I am midway through my second. I've got the DLC to go through, but even kind of going back to check out the first game, I loved seeing like some of those connections, and I know that you're supposed to play it in the opposite order. Obviously, you play the first game then the second, but even playing the second and going back to the first and the Thomas Zane references and like things like that like I'm like, oh, they started here and this is where I'm seeing it. It's been super fun.
Yeah, this part's not going to go in the podcast. I was just going to say, I one of the things that would be interesting to talk to you about, especially in an Alan Wake 2 podcast, would be like Sam Lake said that Alan Wake 2 was made so that you did not have to play any prior game, Control included, but also Alan Wake 1. I still feel strongly that that's a lie. But you probably have a better sense of it than I do, having not really played that much Alan Wake 1.
And so, having not really played Alan Wake 1, I don't think it's wrong to say that like going into the second game without doing the first, you miss stuff, but like it doesn't I feel like it doesn't take away from the game. It doesn't take away from the story they're telling, but playing that first game really does add more to it. It gives you a larger world and it gives you those aha moments. All right, Adrian, I feel like this is really going to wrap up our Alan Wake episode. And before I ask you what we should be looking forward to in the upcoming month, I also want to just say to all of our listeners, don't forget, it's not a loop, it's a spiral.
But also, it's not a lake, it's an ocean.
There we go. All right, Adrian. So on that note, what do we have coming up for next month?
So yeah, next month, we don't have any major releases to tie into. I think we'll do something a little smaller, something a little weirder. Not a very well-known game, although it has come back into the public consciousness, really. A little adventure game from the mid-90s called Harvester. Harvester is not a very well-known game. It's not a very well-notable game, but it's certainly a strange game. And I know a lot of people might have seen it from a certain popular YouTube series and are extremely baffled by it. I actually think it has a very fascinating story, but also no one absolutely should play the game. It's on sale right now on Steam for $1.19 if you want to play it before the podcast to kind of gear yourself up, but also don't. And I'll tell you all about why you should not play it next month.
Well, once again, thank you for listening. My name is Lamont.
I'm Adrian.
And this has been Playing Dread.
You've been listening to Playing Dread, a Q27 media production and a member of the New Jersey Horror Collective, hosted by Lamont Williams and Adrian Sandoval. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends, or just consider leaving us a review and giving us top ranks on your podcast listening service of choice. Check out our show notes at playingdread.libsym.com and consider becoming a Playing Dread patron on Patreon. Social media links including YouTube, Blue Sky, Instagram, and more can be found at www.playingdread.com. All music is under a Creative Commons Attribution license. The intro music is The Curse of the Dolls by Jeff Harvey, and other music in this episode was performed by Alex Grohl, Dimitri Taras, Grand Project, and Pump Up the Mind.